Happy Friday, everyone. Thanks for joining us today on this edition of Arirang News. I'm Lee-Jiun in Seoul. Korea's second-tier Kosdaq hit a 16-year high, crossing 900 points at Tuesday's close for the first time since the early 2000s. Now, this comes on the back of new plans by the government to prop up the Kosdaq by giving tax relief to investors, creating new composite stock market indexes, and lowering the entry barrier for firms to go public on the market. These measures come as the junior markets powerhouse Celltrion is looking to shift to the Kospi market for bigger investment opportunities. And before we sit down with an expert to talk more about this, let's first get a check on what's making the news at this hour with our Devin Whiting at the News Center. Good afternoon, Devin.
Hi, Jiun. Well, first up, the South Korean government has unveiled ambitious plans to use next month's Winter Olympics in PyeongChang as a turning point towards peace on the Korean peninsula. Future outcomes from the North's participation, Seoul says, could even include dialogue between Pyongyang and Washington. Kwon Jung-ho reports.
From PyeongChang to peace. That's the theme to this year's New Year's Diplomacy and Security Policy briefing, handed in to Prime Minister Lee Nak-yeon on Friday. Due to North Korea's involvement, next month's PyeongChang Winter Olympics has become the focus of this year's agenda, with Seoul hoping to use it as a platform to improve inter-Korean relations.
Through the successful hosting of the PyeongChang Winter Olympics, we must try and reach for peace on the Korean peninsula. Our government and the international community must use its wisdom on this small but precious opportunity.
The Unification Ministry pledged to use the momentum from the Games to hold more high-level talks with North Korea, while the Foreign Ministry said it will try to encourage dialogue on an international scale, namely between Washington and Pyongyang. After South and North Korea agreed to make a joint entrance at next month's Olympics, the Culture and Sports Ministry also said it will push for similar entrances at other international sporting events, such as the Jakarta Asian Games in August. The Defense Ministry has pledged to use all its available resources to ensure the safety of PyeongChang 2018. On broader issues in the policy report, the Foreign Ministry outlined plans to increase cooperation with the 4 key strategic partners of US, China, Russia and Japan, while also spreading Seoul's diplomatic influence to non-traditional partner countries. The Unification Ministry has pledged to better represent the opinions of the people in its unification policy, as well as do more to help North Korean defectors adjust to life in the South. Meanwhile, the Defense Ministry has pledged to continue its drive to revamp the military, with plans to reduce the number of troops from the current 610,000 to 500,000 by 2022, and the mandatory military service period from the current 21 months to 18 months. Policy briefings will continue for another 10 days, with government agencies to report on issues such as healthcare, the economy and education. Kwon Jung-ho, Arirang News.
A peaceful resolution to the North Korea nuclear issue and a successful PyeongChang Winter Olympic Games. That's what the leaders of South Korea and France agreed to work on during a 30-minute-long phone conversation Thursday evening. The Blue House said President Moon brought French President Emmanuel Macron up to date on the inter-Korean talks regarding the North's participation in the upcoming Olympic Games in South Korea, and expressed hopes that the latest developments would ease tensions and ultimately lead to a nuclear-free Korean peninsula. Macron, in return, spoke highly of President Moon's efforts to ensure peace on the peninsula and the rest of the world, throwing his support behind the ongoing dialogue. As the two leaders agreed to expand bilateral cooperation and communication on various levels, the South Korean leader invited his French counterpart to his country for the Winter Olympics and Paralympic Games, and President Macron said he will seriously look into the possibility with gratitude. Now, we've been seeing what would appear to be a sudden warming of ties between the two Koreas, with the North scheduled to participate in the upcoming Winter Olympics. But plenty of experts have been warning that the Olympics won't be a cure-all. One of them is Bruce Klingner, a former CIA deputy chief for Korea. Our Kim Hae-sung sat down with him to get his analysis.
A thaw in frosty relations. Resumption of high-level inter-Korean talks and an agreement Wednesday to have a joint entrance for the PyeongChang Winter Olympics under a single flag. Despite hopes that the latest developments can help ease tensions and ultimately lead to a nuclear-free Korean peninsula, some experts warn of caution. Former CIA Deputy Chief for Korea, Bruce Klingner.
Well, it has to be sincere. We've seen any number of cases where we've had sporting events or cultural events, philharmonics visiting North Korea, et cetera. All have come to naught in improving inter-Korean relations or moderating North Korean behavior. So, we need to be, realistic about what might happen as a result of North Korea simply arriving at the Olympics.
Especially as Pyongyang's offering of an olive branch to Seoul comes just weeks after a series of nuclear threats and missile launches. And there are concerns that the North is trying to drive a wedge between South Korea and its allies like the U.S. as sanctions are starting to take a bite on the regime. How to keep the dialogue momentum going beyond the Olympics?
Well, there has to be reciprocity. So North Korea has already articulated a long list of demands that Seoul must provide, and South Korea should make those conditional and also provide their own list.
That list, including reunions of separated families, is agreed on in the 2000 Inter-Korean Summit. And a continuation of Seoul-Washington joint military exercises, which have been postponed for the Winter Games, as emphasized by U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, as a measure of deterrence.
The object of negotiations, if and when we get there, is the complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization of North Korea. Let me be clear, we will not allow North Korea to drive a wedge through our resolve or our solidarity.
Just as 20 countries welcomed the détente between the two Koreas at the Vancouver Foreign Ministers meeting, yet called on the need for continued sanctions and pressure to denuclearize the North.
I think we have to realize that it's a long-term issue. We need deterrence and containment and pressure and work towards long-term regime change as opposed to some near-term, sudden regime change through military means.
김혜성, 아리랑 뉴스.
North Korea said Friday that it wants to send an inspection team to South Korea this Saturday to check the venues where it'll send artists to perform during the Winter Olympics. The 7-member delegation will be led by Hyun Sung-wol, the leader of the all-female Moranbong Band. The Moranbong Band was created in 2012 by North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, featuring Western-style music and outfits. South Korea's unification ministry said the inspection team will use the Gyeonggi Line train, a route on the western side of the peninsula, and they'll stay for 2 days. At working-level talks on Monday, the North agreed to send a 140-member art troupe to perform in the South. I'm Devin Whiting, and those are your news headlines for this hour.
The Bank of Korea raised its growth forecast for the local economy yesterday while leaving the key interest rate untouched, as widely expected. So with the country seemingly on a strong recovery track on the back of an ongoing global economic recovery, we're going to sit down with an expert to take a closer look at global and local stock markets. But before we get to that, here's our Kim Hae-sung with an overview of yesterday's central bank meeting.
The Bank of Korea raised its growth forecast for the local economy for 2018 to 3%, up 0.1 of a percentage point from its previous projection made in October.
Global economic growth has accelerated in both advanced and emerging economies. Korea's domestic economy is expected to continue its solid growth on the back of strong exports and improving consumption, although investment has somewhat slowed.
The central bank lowered its consumer price projection by 0.1 percentage points to 1.7%. It says there are upside and downside risks for inflation. Rising global oil prices are pushing prices up, while the Korean won's rise against the U.S. dollar to its strongest level in more than 3 years is starting to weigh on import costs. With December's core inflation rate below the bank's target of 2% and household debt still growing, the BOK kept its benchmark interest rate unchanged at 1.5% Thursday. This freeze comes after the bank's first rate hike in over 6 years in November.
The rate freeze this month was widely expected. For one thing, inflationary pressure has eased, but also the bank is waiting to see what other countries do with their monetary easing policies before making a move. The fact that Governor Lee Ju-yeol's term is set to end this March was also a factor.
Experts say the central bank is likely to raise rates gradually this year, sometime in the second quarter or later, after policymakers have had more time to assess the impact of the first increase and get clearer signals on the inflation rate. 김혜성, Arirang News.
And to tell us more about the country's stock market and how the secondary Kosdaq index has been narrowing its gap with the Kospi, global strategist Daniel Yu from QM Securities joins us in the studio today. So good to see you.
Pleasure to be here.
All right, so the country's secondary index, the Kosdaq, although it did drop today, it has been generally on an upward trend and narrowing its gap with the Kospi. So, I mean, what does this mean for the local capital market?
Right. If you think about the Korean equity market in general, the Kospi is trading a P multiple of 9 times and Kosdaq is trading at about 20 times, which is about 30 to 50% discount to the global equity market P multiples. So therefore, there's been always discount due to concerns such as the corporate governance issues of Korean companies and also the skewedness towards the Samsung Electronics and the IT sector and chaebols. And also people were worried about the new growth engines. Now, if you're trying to boost the Kosdaq, obviously this will create more money flows to small and medium-sized enterprises, as well as creating a new growth engines. So therefore, this will benefit the overall equity market in general, and there will be a trigger effect from Kosdaq to Kospi in the longer term. So overall market capitalization could rise, and the discount to the global economy will disappear over the period of time, I think.
So what is exactly driving the latest Kosdaq rally?
Right, it's all about government's boosting measures, I think. If you look at some of the measures that's been introduced, the retail investors will get a tax benefit of 3 million won, if you invest into the Kosdaq venture funds, or any pension funds buying the Kosdaq stocks, they'll get exemption on the trading tax. Also, the composite index will be introduced, as well as the Kosdaq venture fund will be introduced by the Korea Exchange. Also, the listing of the Kosdaq by Korean companies will be lowered. The requirements will be lowered. So all this will increase the retail participations towards the Kosdaq market as well as the equity market. Now, Korea, the retail participation to the equity market and capital market is very low. We think that this will gradually rise with the government boosting measures because of a lot of these tax benefits and other measures that are happening. So we think that the re-rating of Korean equity market can happen starting with this Kosdaq measures.
Now, cryptocurrencies have been in the spotlight recently. So what could be the relationship between the secondary Kosdaq and cryptocurrencies?
Right. Well, cryptocurrencies, obviously the retail investors invest. As I said, retail investors' investment into capital market is very important. Now, cryptocurrency, it's very hard to value. It is important that the blockchain technology is very important, but as a substitution to the currency, it's very difficult to answer. So it's against kind of government and central bank. So therefore, I don't know what the fair value of the the bitcoins or the cryptocurrency is. Now, looking into the Minsky models, the smart money goes into these new technologies, and then institutional money, and then public money. So right now, with the listing in US, the public monies are pouring into the cryptocurrencies, and it had a significant rally. And after that, usually it settles down with a big crash. So that's what's happening right now. Now, with that, a lot of the local investors invest into these cryptocurrencies, and the money will probably flow out of that and look for other entry points, and which will be Kosdaq, we think. So right now, Kosdaq, the valuations are still very cheap compared to the global market. And yes, there is a skewness towards the bio stocks, but nevertheless, overall 150 companies in Kosdaq are around trading at 20 times P multiples, and the return on equities are rising, and profits are rising as well. So all that means is that money will flow from cryptocurrency to Kosdaq, we think.
And you just mentioned there are some concerns about skewness to bio and pharmaceutical shares, and obviously Celltrion, biosimilar developer, has been dominating the Kosdaq market. So there has been concerns that there's too much focus on perhaps certain sectors and companies.
Right, so we have to understand what Kosdaq is made of. about 40 to 45% of the market capitalization of Kosdaq is bio and pharmaceutical related sector. Now, trying to value the pharmaceutical sector or the bio sector is very difficult because you don't see the earnings yet.
Right.
And it might take another 1 to 2, even longer years. So if you're just looking at that, definitely Kosdaq could be a bubble. But remaining 55% of the market cap, and if you look at a lot of those companies, it's IT component companies, the China plays, and the consumer stocks, and all these stocks. If you look at the valuations, they're very cheap. So if you add all of it, currently the P multiple is around 20 times, price to book is around 2.5 times book, and return on equity is about 15% plus, which is significantly cheaper than any other growth indices in the world. So therefore, we think that as long as earnings growth is there and there's a continuation of the inflow of the money is occurring, we think that Kosdaq is a lot better way to invest than the cryptocurrency.
But then what would happen if Celltrion shifts to the benchmark Kospi?
Right. Then we have to look at the capitalizations and percentage of the capitalizations. If you look at Kosdaq as a whole, it's about 300 trillion won. And the Kospi is total of 1,600 trillion won. So the Kospi divided by total market capitalization, Kosdaq divided by total market capitalization is about 20%. Now, Celltrion and the other related companies shifting, that amounts to about 50 to 60 trillion won moving. So then the market capitalization will fall for the Kosdaq as a percentage of total from 20% to 15%. So a lot of the investment that's happening to the Kosdaq, they're not buying specifically of the companies. They're buying index ETFs, and obviously government is trying to introduce funds, right? So money will flow and the market capitalization become lower. So we think that supply and demand will be actually benefiting the Kosdaq index. So yes, in the short term, there can be some jitters and volatilities due to the moving of Celltrion. But in a longer term, medium to longer term, we think that more money will flow into the Kosdaq, and therefore the index will stabilize and continue to show some rising trend over the next 12 months.
Earlier, we talked about government measures to boost the Kosdaq market. Now, comparing these plans to the ones of previous administrations, how effective do you think the government's plans will be in boosting the secondary market bourse in the long run?
Well, I mean, you got to think about what happened at the time of Nomuyen's policies. At that time, the Kospi had a big rally from 2003 to 2007, 2008, almost lasted 5 years. During that period of time, the Kospi went from 1,000 to 2,000, went up 100%. But even before that, it started from 500, so it went up about 200%. So therefore, as long as there is some policies that trying to focus on a specific index or equity market, we think that this will benefit the overall market capitalizations in the future. So we think that Kosdaq can rise from what it started around 600 level. Now it's already 900.
Right.
I think that it can go up even as high as 1,100, 1,200.
Wow.
So, and if you look at our residual income models, which will look at what is a fair value of a index, we calculate that Kosdaq's fair value has risen from 600 to now already 1,100. So it's still at cheap level, we think. So with the government policy and the proper way of introducing the directions to invest into these companies, we think that Kosdaq rally can continue and here to stay for another at least 12 to 24 months.
But then, are we seeing signs of perhaps overheating in the Kosdaq market?
I think that everybody talks about the credit borrow to buy the equities. Now, the recent borrowings to buy the equities has reached around 13 trillion won, which if you compare as 1,900 trillion won market capitalization, it's only 0.7% of total, which is not much. Now, in the past, when we had that Nomuyen's push to the Kospi, the credit percentage went up to as high as 2-3%, which is much higher than now. Also, if we compare to China, when there's a big rally of Chinese market, the credit borrowed reached almost 9 to 10% of total market capitalization. So 0.7% versus these numbers are minuscule. So therefore, I think that yes, there's more and more money going in. Yes, the credit borrow is increasing, but that level is not high enough to believe that the market is peaking.
All right. Well, the Kospi has been quite stagnant lately compared to the Kosdaq, and it hasn't been really booming compared to what it did last year. So what's your outlook on the Kospi?
Well, Kospi, it's taking a little bit of time. If you look at last year, 2017, first half, the Kospi did very strong run. And then the second half is the Kosdaq. The reason I think the Kospi is kind of timid right now is because the fourth quarter results came in for Samsung Electronics and IT sector. And because of the heavy won appreciation that happened, the earnings are coming in below expectations. So that's kind of introducing some lagging effect. However, we think that currency appreciation will not accelerate from here. We think they will probably stabilize somewhat. And also, there's a global economic growth continue to happen. So IT sector, we think that it is right now in a super cycle. So therefore, earnings will continue to beat the expectation in the future. So therefore, costs will start to go up again. But the timing-wise, we have to see the numbers. So therefore, we have to wait until probably the first quarter results comes in. So which will be like April or May. Thereafter, we think that Kospi will do very good run. We expect around 20% increase in Kospi this year.
And like we heard in the report, the Bank of Korea kept its key interest rate steady while revising up its growth forecast for this year for the Korean economy to 3%. So how does this come into play in regards to the local stock markets?
Right. Now, in terms of interest rate increase for Bank of Korea, it's much more difficult than U.S. The reason for that is because if you look at the loan-to-deposit ratio of the Korean banks, it has reached well above 90%. It's almost to 100%. That's what means is that there's quite a bit of loans that given to the consumers. So therefore, there is a difficulties of boosting the domestic consumptions. However, Korea's as far as GDP is concerned, 70% comes from exports. So if the global economy is very, very strong, then yes, you can create 3% growth in the GDP, and which will benefit which companies? Not consumers, but the exporters. So therefore, won appreciation is also important. So all that related, we think that the earnings for the Korean companies will be coming in strong due to global economic growth, which resulting into 3% growth in the Korean economy, and the earnings growth can lead into a equity market going up.
Now, China's economy grew 6.9% in 2017, topping the government's target of around 6.5%, despite financial risks stemming from, I guess, economic restructuring led by the Chinese government. So this must be good news for the global stock market.
Yes, obviously it is. Every year, even 2015, 2016, or long before that, 2013, every year everybody talks about Chinese debt. The corporate debts are high. It's already, everybody knows about this. But there are some issues that where you can kind of shake the economies. And what it means is if you have to look at the net interest margin of the banking sector, can they control the non-performing assets? Is margin stabilizing? And all this is very important. And also how to stabilize it is because if the economic growth comes in strong, then you can stabilize it. So the economic growth coming in better than expectation resulted into net interest margin coming in better than expectations. And therefore, you cannot shake the economies at this point, which means that the emerging market will do very well. So this year, we expected this to happen. Emerging market will do better than the developed market. If you look at the best performing market in the world right now, it's Russia. And then after that, it will be Vietnam, and also Chinese, the largest caps, and others. So we think that this year is emerging markets year. The equity market in general will do well with the China being stable.
All right. Thank you so much for your insight today.
Thank you.
And that wraps it up for today and this week, but we'll be back next week with more of the day's top stories and an in-depth look at ongoing issues here in Korea and around the world. So don't forget to check back with us then. Thanks for watching and see you soon.